Hello, YouTube. I just wanted to make a quick response to a comment exchange that I had with Kyle Rivelli surrounding the question of anarchism. And also, Vic Mackey in the latest Google Hangout asked me if I was an anarchist. Um, and I responded with maybe. The reason being that I think it's it depends on what you mean when you say the word anarchist, right? Um, for me, though, I would self-identify as an anarchist in the sense that for me, anarchism is a uh, it's an ethical maxim, right? It's a it's essentially the claim or the heart of anarchism for me is the claim that structures of power, right, structures that levy power over one group over another, or one person over a group, or anything like that, those structures are not legitimate by definition. They have a burden of proof to bear. Um, it's not sufficient to say that it's not sufficient to just take them for granted, right? That's what anarchism is for me. And this isn't such a crazy claim, especially in the world within which we live. We have things like Wikipedia, which is uh, organized on something like anarchist principles, at least to a limited extent, right? Science at its best is anarchist principles, though they wouldn't necessarily be called anarchist principles within the world of science. Anarchist principles form the basis of science, right? Anti-authoritarianism, um, uh, you know, collaborative effort, you know, peers arguing it out, right? And in a horizontal landscape. It's not, I mean, and that's not completely true. Things like how science gets its funding is certainly not organized on anarchist principles, but I just mean the activity of science. It's also at its best when it's done on anarchist principles, I think. Um, so, I mean, we see all these structures in our world constantly. I know that a group of anarchists in New Orleans here have, for instance, organized a very limited higher education system that is completely volunteer based and completely free, right? Uh, this is an anarchist activity, offering volunteer higher education to people. It's not a bad thing either. I mean, obviously, it's not a bad thing. Um, these kinds of projects are where the soul of anarchism is. The soul of anarchism is not in the attempt to sketch out a future society, right? Um, there is no model. There is no model of what an anarchist society would look like, right? Um, so when you say something, Kyle's response to me was, how would you deal with the issue of national defense and the issue of innovation within an anarchist society? It's a meaningless question. Um, uh, you can organize a society on anarchist principles, but um, you can organize any number of societies on anarchist principles, actually. But there's no it how the issue of national defense would be handled would have to be handled within a concrete reality, right? We can't talk about this in abstraction. And the reason why is that the challenges that you would face, the military challenges you would face, are determined by various different things. Um, Chile, for example, if they were to have an anarchist revolution, they would have a very different set of tasks in constructing their military than if the United States were, and that gap, that distance renders that question meaningful in one context, meaningful in another context, but completely, like, I don't see any way to generalize what that would look like. So a question like, okay, national defense, should a military be hierarchically constructed? Well, it doesn't have to, in principle, be hierarchically constructed, right? We have things like militias that aren't. In the the Spanish Civil War in Catalonia, which is the great anarchist event, right? All of a sudden, half of Spain turned into a collection of anarchist communes for, for about a year and a half, and then it was sort of subverted. Like, this is the only example in history where the Axis powers, the Allied powers, and the Soviets collaborated, right? Like the communists, the fascists, and America and England collaborated to make sure that this didn't get off the ground. So, when you talk about, it sort of fell apart, it's not surprising that it fell apart. The fact that they were even able to hold their ground for as long as they did is amazing. And people, if you watch interviews with people who were there, they talk about it with almost a religious reference, a religious feeling behind it. It was the greatest thing that ever happened to them, right? But that's all beside the point. Their military, until they were subverted by the Soviets, actually ended up being the ones who most effectively dismantled it, and then the fascists came in and crushed them. But before that happened, their militaries weren't hierarchically organized. That's, they were able to hold off the fascist forces without a hierarchical military, which is, I'm not sure how relevant that is to today, but it's relevant to the principle of whether or not national defense, the conversation about national defense, is a coherent, whether or not it can work within anarchist principles. There's no reason that it can't, that I can see, is the point. And it would be very different depending on which country you're talking about. So, those are questions that, I just don't think it's meaningful to ask, right? And in some way, this is Marx's point too. Marx never sketches out what communism would look like. People don't realize this. I think people sort of dive into criticizing Marxism on the basis of the Soviet Union, but that's, silly. Marx never lays out what communism is going to look like, or socialism, because for Marx it's three stages. It's capitalism, then the revolution happens, and it's socialism, and then the state withers away, and then you have communism, which is a stateless, classless society. So Marx never sketches out what socialism would look like, and the reason why is that it's up to the proletariat for Marx. It's up to the people who do this. It's not up to me, right? If I'm Marx, it's not up to me to sketch that out. That would be dominating, and also I would have to bring to bear language and concepts from this society onto that, which could be problematic, right? From a theoretical perspective, it can be problematic. The same thing is true. This is the same feeling that I have when somebody asks me something like, how would national defense function in an anarchist society, or how would innovation function in an anarchist society? And it's up to them, right, to negotiate that, and it's up to them to deal with the concrete problems that face them. It's not up to me to lay that out. Um, I don't see any benefit in laying that out, and it seems bankrupt from the get go. It seems like a bankrupt job, especially given that, I don't see that anarchism, especially given that I see anarchism at its most vibrant is within existing societies. Um, so I don't know. I'm not in the business of constructing abstract utopias, right? And some people are, like, it's been tried. There is no model that's universally accepted. Um, but I mean, it's just like I can't emphasize enough that I feel like it's a meaningless question, or it's not a meaningless question, but it's a question that has so many historical and material contingencies built into it that it's a question that I can't answer, right? And that's not a weakness either, right? That's not a weakness in the position of anarchism. All that is just a recognition that, and this would be true in any utopian conception, right? Um, um, that's not to say these questions aren't important, though. We should get around to that. I mean, if you really look at how the Soviet Union consolidated power, it was because of the fact that they were in a civil war, right? It was the Red Army versus the White Army. The White Army funded by the British um, and the Americans too. I mean, the liberal democracies didn't want them, so they funded internal insurgencies in Russia, and then so the Bolsheviks were at war. That became like the grounds by which the authoritarian structures cropped up. It became, you know, the war situation became the grounds that the democratic aspects of the Soviet, or what was to become the Soviet Union, sort of melted away. Um, uh, so yeah, the question of how it would be done is actually very important, but it it has to be handled in the time and place by the people who are trying to reorganize their society. It's just not it like there's a gap that I can't get across in principle in order to answer this question. I can't step outside my who and where I am to think through this. So yeah, and it also, like, even try to even construct a model of an ideal society also neuters the it neuters the project, doesn't it? Because then it turns into an intellectual exercise. It turns into something to be, like, debated, right? I don't see anarchism as something. I mean, it's something that I'm happy to debate, but it's not something that I see as essentially something to be debated. It's something to be sort of carried out, right? It's something to be. It's an activity. Um, this is, my conception of anarchism might be very close to how Foucault conceives of his intellectual project. Actually, his goals, and he lays this out in his debate with Chomsky. But if you look at his books, right, it's the history of madness, which is about how the notion of mental health is used as a lever of power, right? The history of the prison, which is obviously about power, right? The history of sexuality and how that's about power, right? All of these things, his works are about the historical development of the subject and power relations, and where that lands us today, right? I don't. He says, I think it's in the preface to Discipline and Punish. I don't. I think it's meaningful to write a history of the past. Instead, I'm going to write a history of the present. Right? That's an, as far as I can tell, that's an anarchist project, and I'm not the first one to point that out, right? But he never, ever, ever goes about the business of sketching out a society. So you can see the distinction. I think by this point you can probably make out like where the misstep is from the get go, right? Um, uh, there's it just doesn't. The question betrays a misconception of what anarchism, and I'd say probably utopian politics in general, is all about, and why we carry it out. It's a mishandling of those questions. Um, so yeah, I wanted to make a video response because I felt like unpacking why would probably be beyond the scope of a YouTube comment. Sorry if this is a little rambly. I more or less just woke up. uh, Thank you very much, YouTube. Anybody who's watching, thank you for watching, and have a good day.